your slides and we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I am Lindsey Chiono. I am an assistant project leader on the rainwater and wildlife area, rainwater and Wanakit wildlife areas and the Escopa watershed project, which is located on the reservation. And my educational background is in forest ecology and fire science. And so today I have the honor of talking to you about the effects of climate change on big game, really through the lens of forest health and habitat conditions. So in the past, our Blue Mountain forests originally got their name because of the smoke and haze that would hang over the mountains during the dry season, as a result of frequent fire that came from both cultural burning and lightning ignited wildfire. And fire back then in our dry pine and mixed conifer forests at our low and mid elevation forests. So these are the most common types of forests that we have here in the Blue Mountains. Fire in this ecosystem tended to be low severity. It tended to stick to the forest floor and would occasionally kill patches of trees or individual trees. But the effect of it was to maintain these large diameter fire tolerant trees, things like pine and larch, while removing the more fire sensitive species like grand fir. But our forests have seen pretty dramatic change in about the last century, where we've seen this condition develop in a pretty widespread way across the landscape, where fire intolerant but shade loving trees like grand fir have moved into the forest understory and then gradually into the overstory, and increase the continuity of that biomass and that carrier of fire across the forest. And so when we do now have wildfires, we often see them turn into these really large-scale, high-severity events, maybe burning over tens of thousands of acres. Another effect of removing fire as a disturbance component in our forests is that we see a lot more competition for the resources on a site, and that competition leads to stress, which makes trees more susceptible to disease and insect outbreaks. We have some special types of ecosystems that are especially valuable to wildlife, especially big game, and I'm thinking of aspen ecosystems. And the removal from fire from these ecosystems had an especially big effect, because these are really fire maintained habitats, and in the absence of fire, eventually conifers move into the understory and eventually overtop the aspen, and they lose their vigor. So removing fire from our landscapes also had huge impacts on the forest understory plants. Many of our forage plants that big game species use have a lot of adaptation to frequent disturbance. Species like pine grass and elk sedge and many of our shrub species are able to resprout after fire from root crowns and from below ground rhizomes. And the protection of that kind of soil insulation keeps them from being killed by fire and allows them to quickly respond after burning to take advantage of the kind of newly available resources that are made available by burning. Another common adaptation is wind dispersed seed. Pine grass is another one that moves into a site really quickly after burning and can take advantage of it by these really small wind dispersed seed. And kind of conversely, some species are able to live in the soil seed bank for a long period, so they can wait out a lack of burning so that again, they can take advantage of newly available resources. And a lot of our species actually exhibit multiple strategies to deal with fire. For example, common snowberry can survive a low intensity fire just with its soil seed bank, but a higher intensity fire might kill the seed that's in the soil. And when that happens, it could actually respond just by resprouting from the rhizome. So it can handle a variety of disturbance intensities. So back in the 1930s, Several Forest Service employees visited these wildfire observation points around the region, and their intention was to evaluate what kind of coverage their wildfire observation points had in terms of their ability to detect wildfires on the landscape so that they could eventually use that information to go and suppress the wildfires. So back in the 30s, these photos were taken. The above photo is from 1935, and it's taken from Griffin Peak, which is just south of the Rainwater Wildlife Area, looking out to the west and west-northwest. And what you can see, comparing it to this more recent photo from 2019, this photo was taken by John Marshall, who recently went back and revisited a lot of those sites from the 1930s and repeated these photos so that we could compare the changes in our landscape. And so what you see is a much more patchy landscape. There are many fewer trees and much more open conditions, and really you can see this across the landscape. The next photo I'm going to show you is a close-up of this hill slope here, just for reference. And so again, the photo on the left is taken in 1935, compared to the photo on the right from 2019. And really what you see is just how much the trees have responded to the lack of fire and really filled in all of these canopy gaps over time. And so you just see a lot less patchiness and a lot more tree density. So this is a similar set of photos, but this time from just west of Ukiah, about 16 miles. It's taken from Arbuckle Mountain and looking out towards Bald Mountain there in the middle of the screen there. And really what you're seeing again is that patchiness that was maintained by an active fire regime that has really just become this sea of green. And what we're seeing is basically this kind of epidemic of trees. You can especially see it here in the foreground, I think. So that big change in the landscape, that the development of really continuous structural conditions has some big implications for generalist species like our big game species that use both high density cover for security and thermal cover and for travel, but also need more open space that provides a lot of forage. And the proximity of those various habitat types really matters. For example, a study out of Western Montana found that during the summer, elk generally remained within about 200 yards of their foraging areas, moving back and forth between various habitat types. So just the proximity of habitat types available in that mosaic, it really matters. And I included this slide just to remind us that this webinar is focused on big game habitats, but habitat diversity across the landscape is important to supporting a huge variety of wildlife species, from habitat specialists to those that use a lot of different habitat types. So when I think about climate change against this backdrop, I really think about it as a factor that's going to be intensifying the forest health challenges that we're already seeing. The earlier snowmelt and the lower snowpacks are going to reduce soil moisture, and that will intensify competition for soil moisture in particular and increase vulnerability to more disease and insect outbreaks. A warmer climate alone could increase the potential for insect outbreaks. And a longer summer drought season really equates to more fire, more frequent fire, larger fires, and then more area burned at high severity when we do have wildfires. But there's some tools that forest managers have that can help to increase the resilience of our forest ecosystems and help restore some of that patchiness. And so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some projects that are underway on tribally owned properties. So both the forestry programs and the wildlife program have a number of projects underway to alter some of our forest structure and reduce fire to these systems. This is an example from the Rainwater Wildlife Area. Jerry Medell, the project leader at Rainwater, implemented a thinning project about 7 years ago, back in 2013. And it's a great illustration, I think, of the big understory response we expect to see when we open up the forest canopy. And these, just for comparison, are from a stand just adjacent to that thinned out stand. And what you see is a whole lot more fuel buildup and these fairly dark understories that really don't support much understory plant or forage. And this is another example on the reservation. This is the Telephone Ridge area around Chaplash Canyon. And back in 2017, we implemented a forest thinning project followed by pile burning with support from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. And before treatment, the stand was this combination of really dense, kind of decadent shrub species that was just really hard to walk through. And then combined with these patches of really dense, small diameter conifer trees that were really limiting the resource available to understory plants. This is a couple of photos from the work being done. And before treatment, Scott, who you just heard from, set up this array of cameras in the stand to record changes in wildlife use of the stands. And the numbers haven't been crunched yet, so I can tell you that what we did see was a dramatic increase in the use of the stand by elk. The cameras after treatment recorded foraging behavior and quite a bit of it throughout the period of camera trapping from March through August. And whereas before treatment, we saw essentially just elk moving through the stand and not really spending a lot of time in it. The cameras also recorded several species after treatment that were not recorded before treatment, including cougar, wolf, and mule deer, and also recorded mule deer foraging after treatment, and also a big increase in bear use of the habitat. So that was a couple examples of how forest management activities can help to increase the resilience of our forest landscapes to climate change and improve forage conditions for big game species. If you have any questions or ideas or thoughts that don't get addressed in our later discussion session, feel free to send me an email. And with that, I'll pass it along to the next speaker.